We were miles from the nearest town, camping by a quiet lake deep in the forest. My husband, a retired cop, had insisted on coming here. Even at 72, he's strong, and he's always saying he can still look out for himself and for me. He trusts his gut, and after so many years on the job, he says he can tell when there's trouble nearby. We parked the truck close to the water and set up our small tent right beside it. As night fell, a deep silence settled over the place. It was so quiet that it almost felt lonely, but with my husband by my side, I felt safe. Or at least I thought I did. Around midnight, I woke up with this strange feeling. Something was off. My husband was already awake, sitting up at the edge of the tent and staring out toward the woods. I could tell he'd noticed something too, though he hadn't said anything about it before. The night was completely still. No usual sounds of insects or wind in the trees. It was as if everything had gone dead quiet, like something had silenced the whole forest. He didn't need to say a word for me to understand he was tense. Then we heard it. A crunch, like someone stepping on dry leaves, moving slow, careful. It was close, way too close. The sound stopped, then started up again, moving around us. Whoever or whatever it was seemed to be circling our tent, staying just out of sight in the darkness. We stayed completely still, listening. The steps grew louder, heavier, with a slow, steady rhythm. Whoever it was, they kept circling, each time coming a little closer. My husband reached into the tent and took out his hunting knife, his hand calm but tight on the handle. He motioned for me to stay low and quiet, and I could see a serious look on his face, one I hadn't seen in a long time. The footsteps stopped suddenly, just a few feet from the tent. Silence hung in the air, thick and heavy, and I could feel my heart pounding. My husband kept his eyes locked on where the sound had come from, not moving, just waiting. Then, out of nowhere, a hand pressed against the side of the tent, sliding along the fabric like it was feeling for something. I held my breath, feeling each finger drag along the side. My husband tightened his grip on the knife, ready to strike if they tried to come in. The hand stayed there for a few long seconds. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. I could hear the footsteps slowly moving away, growing fainter until everything went silent again. We sat there, barely breathing, for what felt like hours. Finally, as dawn started to light up the sky, we stepped out of the tent. My husband scanned the area around us, but there was no sign of anyone. No footprints, nothing to show anyone had been there. Just a heavy, strange quiet that felt unnatural. I almost convinced myself that we'd imagined it, but then I noticed something that sent a shiver down my spine. On the side of the tent, right where the hand had touched, was a dark, smeared mark. It wasn't dirt. It looked like dried blood, and right beside it was a single handprint, pressed so hard into the fabric that it left a deep mark. We didn't wait to find out who or what had been out there with us. By the time the sun was fully up, we'd packed up everything and were driving away, not looking back. But as we pulled out onto the dirt road leading away from the lake, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. That's when I saw it. A shadowy figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching us go, motionless and alone. It didn't move, didn't follow, just stood there watching us leave. To this day, I have no idea who or what that was or what they wanted. But I do know this, we weren't alone that night. And every time I think about it, I wonder if they're still out there, waiting in the woods, watching for the next unlucky soul to camp by that lake. The thought of it, of that silent hand pressing into the tent, sends a chill down my spine that I can't shake, even now. I planned the camping trip to be quick and simple, a solo night out to clear my head. The spot I picked wasn't far from the US-Mexico border. Not the safest place, but it was quiet and out of the way. I figured nobody else would be around. The drive took longer than I thought, and by the time I got there, the sun was going down. Dark clouds were moving in, and soon, rain started pouring down hard as I finished setting up my tent. The rain beat down in a steady rhythm, blocking out every other noise around me. First, the rain was relaxing. It was just me, surrounded by nature, with nothing to think about but the rain. But after a while, a strange feeling crept over me. I couldn't explain why, but something felt wrong. I tried to ignore it, blaming it on the fact that I was alone in such an empty place. With the rain keeping me inside the tent, I had nothing to do but sit there and listen. Every now and then, I'd hear noises outside. Sometimes it was just the rain hitting rocks and branches, but then I'd hear something that sounded different, like something stepping through the mud. I told myself it was probably a small animal, but the sound was too heavy, and the steps seemed too careful, almost like someone was trying to be quiet. A couple of hours passed, and I tried to relax, thinking I was just letting my imagination get the best of me. But then I heard footsteps. These were slow, heavy steps moving closer. My heart started racing. I lay still, holding my breath, hoping whoever or whatever was out there would leave. The footsteps circled my tent slowly, and through the fabric, I saw a shadow. It was faint, but it looked tall, definitely a person. The rain pounded harder, making it tough to hear anything clearly, but that just made things worse. Whoever was outside was trying not to be noticed, and that could only mean they didn't want me to know they were there. I tried to stay calm, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever it was wasn't just passing by. Minutes felt like hours as I lay there, frozen, listening to the sounds outside. Finally, the shadow moved away, but my sense of relief was short-lived. Every sound seemed sharper. Every shift of the rain made me think they might be back. I stayed curled up in my sleeping bag, barely breathing, and after a long stretch of silence, I heard footsteps again. This time, there were more of them, and it sounded like several people were moving around just outside. I held my breath, not daring to make a sound, hoping they'd leave. Then I heard one of them whispering, too low to make out the words, but it was clear they were talking about me. Suddenly, the zipper on my tent rattled, and my blood went cold. I couldn't move, couldn't think, just lay there, hoping they'd lose interest and go. The zipper stopped, but then something pressed down on the tent, like they were testing to see how strong it was. A moment later, the weight lifted, and I heard the footsteps fade into the distance. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I just lay there, trembling, waiting for the sun to come up. When dawn finally broke, I packed up as quickly as I could and drove away, not looking back. On my way home, I stopped at a gas station to fill up. The guy at the counter gave me a weird look, probably because I looked exhausted and shaken. He asked if I'd been camping nearby, and I nodded. He shook his head, frowning, and said, "People don't usually camp out that way. Not with all the stuff going on around the border." He didn't need to explain. I'd read stories about smugglers and traffickers, people who didn't want anyone seeing what they were doing out there. As I drove home, I thought about how close I'd come to something bad. I had no idea who those people were or what they wanted, but I knew that if I'd made one wrong move, they wouldn't have left me alone. It's been a while since that night, but I still think about it, and it chills me to know they let me go only because they wanted to. The thought I can't shake is that they might still remember me, that they might be out there, waiting for the next person who makes the mistake of camping too close to that line between safe and dangerous. And I wonder, with a shiver, if next time they won't just walk away. I'd been out in the forest for a few days, working on a project to find a better treatment for snake bites. My work took me deep into remote areas where I knew the risk was high. The plan was to camp close to spots where snakes lived, study how they behaved, and gather information that could hopefully help save lives. That evening, I set up camp a few miles from my car, next to a small stream. It was known to have lots of snakes around, especially rattlesnakes and cottonmouths. As the sun set, I went over my notes by flashlight. The forest around me was quiet, with just the occasional rustle of leaves as night settled in. Around midnight, I decided to get some sleep. I crawled into my sleeping bag inside the tent, feeling the cool night air coming through the fabric. Just as I was drifting off, I felt something strange, a light weight moving slowly along my leg. My heart stopped, and I knew exactly what it was before I even looked. There was a snake in my tent with me. Slowly, I glanced down and saw the rough pattern of a rattlesnake, its body sliding across my thigh, making its way toward my chest. I lay there, barely breathing, knowing that any quick movement could set it off. The snake moved calmly, its scales brushing against my skin. The flashlight beside me showed its thin, gray scales, and I could see the shape of its head. My only option was to wait. I'd read about situations like this. Panic would only make things worse. I lay there, every muscle tight, barely blinking, hoping it would just keep moving. My mind started racing. I was miles away from help, and if it bit me, my chances of surviving would be low. I thought about my first aid kit outside, which had antivenom in it, but I knew that by the time I could get to it, it might be too late. Finally, the snake paused, lifting its head close to my chest, as if it could feel my heartbeat. Then, as if it decided I wasn't a threat, it slowly turned and started to slither back down. I held my breath, waiting, hoping. Sweat was running down my face, every nerve in my body tense. But just when I thought it was over, the worst happened. The snake's tail caught on the edge of my sleeping bag, and suddenly I felt a sharp, stabbing pain in my leg. I didn't scream, couldn't. I just lay there, feeling a burning pain spread up my leg. At that moment, I knew I was in serious trouble. The bite was already swelling, and the pain was getting worse by the second. I forced myself to sit up, crawling out of the tent and grabbing my kit with shaking hands. I managed to give myself a dose of the antivenom, but deep down, I knew it wasn't enough. My leg throbbed as the venom spread. I tried to stand and start walking back to my car, but each step made my vision blur, and I could feel my strength slipping away. The forest around me was dark and completely silent, except for the faint sounds of distant animals. My legs buckled, and I fell to the ground, lying there in the dirt and leaves, surrounded by nothing but shadows. Lying there, I felt the darkness closing in, the venom spreading through me. I was alone, miles from anyone who could help, with only my dim flashlight casting a weak light around me. I knew the chances of making it out were slim, but I fought to stay awake, hoping against hope for some way out. As the darkness grew deeper and colder, I thought about all the times I'd read stories of people in situations like this, thinking I'd know exactly what to do. But out here, alone in the forest, none of that knowledge mattered. The forest didn't care about my plans or my preparations. It was just me, lying there in the dirt, realizing I'd wandered too far from safety. The last thing I remember was the dim circle of light from my flashlight slowly fading, as if the forest itself was pulling me into the dark, swallowing me up without a trace. Out here, I was just another small thing that no one would ever find. I had picked a thick, quiet part of the forest, far from any paths or campsites. It seemed like the perfect spot, surrounded by tall pines and thick bushes that kept most people away. I'd come out there alone with only my axe, a tent, and enough supplies for the weekend. My plan was simple: chop some wood for a fire, relax in the woods by myself, and camp overnight. By the time evening rolled in, I had a decent stack of logs and sticks, enough to keep a fire going all night. The whole area was silent, except for a few rustling leaves or the occasional twig snapping. But as the light started to fade, I got this strange feeling that something wasn't right, like I wasn't alone. Felt like someone might be watching me. I shook it off as just my nerves and kept setting up my tent, getting everything ready for the night. When night fully settled in, the quiet became heavier, almost like a weight pressing down on everything. Every tiny noise felt louder, sharper. I tried to ignore it, sitting close to my fire and warming my hands, telling myself it was just the usual sounds of the forest. But then I heard something nearby, a steady, crunching sound like footsteps moving through the leaves. They would start, then stop, then start again, like whoever it was didn't want to be heard or wasn't sure where they were going. I held my breath and listened hard, hoping the sounds would drift away. Instead, they seemed to move around my camp, slowly circling. At times, they would come closer, then move back into the darkness, and then come closer again. I stared into the fire, my heart pounding, my hands starting to shake, but I couldn't bring myself to look into the trees. I thought it might be an animal, but the steps were too slow, too careful, almost like they were waiting for me to look. Hours went by, and the footsteps kept coming and going, moving from one side of my camp to the other. I stayed tense, hardly blinking, gripping my axe tightly as my hands got sweaty. When I finally tried to get some sleep, I kept the axe close by, lying stiff on the hard ground, listening. I must have drifted off at some point because the next thing I knew, it was early morning, and the forest had gone completely silent again. As I packed up my stuff, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Just a few feet from where I'd been sleeping, the ground was covered in small, muddy boot prints. They circled my tent, paused right beside where I had been lying, and then led off into the trees. Whoever it was had been standing there, in the dark, just watching me sleep. The whole hike back, I felt like eyes were still on me, like I was being followed. Even when I got to my car and finally drove off, I couldn't shake the feeling. And the thought kept coming back to me. Someone had been out there, close enough to reach out and touch me in the night, but they hadn't. They just stood there watching, waiting. And I still don't know if they'd just let me go, or if they were still out there waiting for me to come back. Camping in the Amazon was something I had always wanted to try, though I knew it could be dangerous. My gym partner, my dad, and I thought it would be an adventure we'd never forget. So we packed everything we'd need and set off into the thick, hot forest, my dog Max right by my side. The trees rose high around us, so tall they blocked out most of the light, and soon it felt like we'd left the world behind. The first day went by smoothly. We set up our tents by a small river, had dinner, and talked about the trip and our plans for exploring. Max stayed close, sniffing around, his ears up and alert. As the sun went down, the forest started to get louder. The sounds of animals and insects filled the air, almost like they were right beside us. It was strange at first, but after a while, the noise almost became background sound, like traffic in the city. When we went to sleep that night, I could barely relax. The jungle had a way of making you feel like someone or something was always watching you. Every little noise, the rustling leaves, branches snapping, made me jump. By morning, though, I convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks, and I got ready for the day. We spent the morning hiking and checking out nearby trails. The air was thick and hot, and by noon we were sweating like crazy. We headed back to camp to rest, but when we got there, something looked off. Our things had been moved around. The bags we'd left by a tree were scattered, and the tents looked like they'd been nudged. At first, we thought maybe an animal had wandered through, just curious. But when we checked, nothing was missing. Everything was just moved. It was strange, but I brushed it off, thinking maybe animals were just checking out our stuff. Later that night, as we sat around the fire, Max suddenly got up and started growling at the trees. His body was tense, his growl low and steady. He wouldn't stop staring at something we couldn't see. He stayed like that for what felt like forever, just watching. Eventually, he settled down, but the feeling that something was wrong didn't leave. The next night was worse. I was half asleep when I heard a quiet sound, like something was scraping or dragging along the ground. I held my breath, listening closely. Max was awake but staying quiet, just watching. My gym partner moved slightly, sitting up and listening too. The sound got closer, circling our tents. It was too slow and quiet to be an animal. My whole body was tense. I wanted to believe it was just some animal, but then I heard something that made my heart start racing. The sound of footsteps, slow and steady, right outside my tent. I froze, hoping it was all in my head, but the footsteps kept going, moving from one tent to the next. My dad's tent was right next to mine, and I could hear him lying perfectly still, listening too. None of us moved, not wanting to make a sound, as the footsteps circled us, again and again. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The jungle went completely silent. Even the insects seemed to have gone quiet, like the whole forest was waiting for something. I lay there, unable to sleep, just staring into the darkness, hoping for dawn. When the sun finally started to rise, we all knew it was time to leave. We packed up quickly, each of us glancing back toward the trees, as if expecting to see something watching. Max stayed close to my side, his usual energy replaced with quiet alertness. Whatever had been out there, he sensed it too. As we walked back through the jungle, the feeling of being watched never left. Every now and then, I'd catch a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye, something shifting in the shadows. I told myself it was just the jungle playing tricks, that there was nothing really out there. But deep down, I knew better. We all did. Finally, we reached the edge of the forest as the sun was fully up, and I felt a huge sense of relief seeing the open sky. But I made the mistake of glancing back one last time, and there it was, a dark shape half hidden in the trees, just standing there, watching. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stayed there, as if it was letting us go but could follow any time it wanted. Even now, I still feel that gaze, like it never really left. The Amazon might be full of life, but it hides things that don't belong, things that don't want to be seen. And whatever had been out there with us, I know it could have done something if it wanted to. I don't know what would have happened if we'd stayed even one more night, but I have a feeling it wouldn't have let us leave. I remember the time I went camping with my grandparents. We had done it a few times before, but this trip felt different. We were far out in the woods, where no one else seemed to be. The trees were thick, and the air had that fresh, damp smell you get deep in the forest. It seemed like the perfect spot, or at least I thought it was. We set up our tent next to a small, quiet stream. Everything seemed calm and peaceful at first. My grandfather made a fire, and my grandmother started making food. I helped a little, but most of the time, I just enjoyed the sound of the stream and the cool breeze on my face. The night came fast, and the forest around us got quieter and darker. After we ate, we sat by the fire. The fire was the only light in the dark woods. My grandparents didn't seem bothered by anything, but I couldn't shake this uneasy feeling. The silence felt heavy, like something was waiting. It was a weird feeling, and I didn't know why, but I kept it to myself. I thought maybe I was just imagining things. The first thing that made me feel like something was wrong happened when the fire flickered. It was like something blew on it, but there was no wind. Then I heard a noise from the bushes, like something was moving through them. At first, I thought it was a deer or some other animal, but the sound didn't seem right. Too heavy, like it was being done on purpose. I stayed close to the fire, telling myself it was nothing. But the noises didn't stop. They got louder, closer. I started to notice something strange. The shadows around the tent weren't moving like they should. The trees weren't swaying at all, but the shadows seemed to shift, like something was moving behind them. My heart started beating faster. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I peeked out from behind the tent, trying to see what was out there, but the trees were too thick. I couldn't see anything. Then the noises came again, louder this time, even closer. I could feel it like something was watching us. I grabbed my flashlight, turning it on and shining it into the dark woods. The beam cut through the trees for a second, and I swear I saw something move fast, just out of reach of the light. It was like it was trying to stay hidden, but I knew it was there. I froze. My breath caught in my chest, and I couldn't move. Then, as suddenly as it started, the noises stopped. The forest went completely silent. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, but everything else was dead quiet. We sat there waiting, but nothing happened. The silence grew thicker, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I finally worked up the courage to check outside the tent. I didn't see anything. The woods were just empty, nothing out of the ordinary. But even though I couldn't see anything, I knew something was off. It felt like the air was wrong, heavy, almost like something was still there, watching. My grandparents went to bed, completely unaffected by what had happened. To them, it was just another night camping. But I couldn't sleep.
I lay there, listening to the silence.
It was a different kind of quiet, the kind that makes you feel like you're not alone, like someone or something is out there waiting. Morning finally came and I was relieved, but that night still haunted me. It wasn't the kind of creepy feeling you get from a story. It was something real, something I couldn't explain. I've never gone back camping in that spot again. But every time I hear the wind in the trees or the rustle of leaves, I think about that night. The woods had felt too still, like they were holding something back. The silence after the noises, that was the worst part. It wasn't a quiet you expect in nature. It was too perfect, too empty. I don't know if it was just the woods being quiet or if it was something more. All I know is that something out there knew we were there, and it didn't want us to know it was watching. I was stationed at the border, in a remote area so isolated that the trees were so thick, the sunlight hardly made it through. It had been weeks of being out there, just me, the land, and nothing else. The place was known for being dangerous with rough ground and the constant threat of people crossing where they shouldn't. But more than anything, it was the silence. It wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet. It was a silence that made your skin crawl, like something was out there watching. That night, I was on my own, which wasn't unusual, but it still felt odd. I was supposed to be on duty, keeping an eye out, but I had set up camp for a bit of rest. The sky was dark, covered with stars, but the woods felt strange. There were no sounds, no animals, no wind, nothing. Just the trees swaying in a breeze that didn't make any noise. It was the kind of silence that felt wrong, like something wasn't right. Something was hiding, waiting. I sat by the fire, poking it with a stick to keep it going. The crackle was the only sound. My flashlight sat next to me, its light flickering weakly. Then I heard it, a sound. It wasn't the usual rustling of an animal, but something more deliberate, like someone was out there. My neck went stiff. I reached for my rifle and stood up slowly, heart pounding, eyes scanning the dark. At first, I thought it was just an animal, but then the noise kept going. It wasn't the usual sounds of wildlife, this was different. Something was moving through the brush, heavy and slow, like it was trying to make sure I heard it. I strained my eyes, trying to make sense of the darkness. A shadow moved by the trees, quick but clear, like a person. My pulse raced. I was alone and I knew it. I stood still for what felt like hours, trying to figure out what it was. Every crack of a branch made me jump. The shadow was still there, moving closer now, and it wasn't an animal. It wasn't a person either. The way it moved was too controlled, too careful. My gut told me it wasn't natural, but I didn't know what it was. The wind picked up again, and the trees made those strange, whispering noises. But there was no usual wildlife.
No birds, no insects.
Nothing. Just an empty, cold stillness. It was as if the whole forest had gone dead silent, as if everything had stopped breathing. After a while, I couldn't just stand there. I grabbed my flashlight and started moving toward the shadows. My heart hammered in my chest with every step. It wasn't fear that made me walk toward it. It was the need to know what was out there. But as I got closer, I smelled it. A sour, damp, rotten smell that made my stomach twist. I nearly turned and ran right then, but I couldn't. Something kept pulling me forward, like I had to see it, whatever it was. Then, through the dim light of the flashlight, I saw it. Not a person, not an animal, but something else. A pile of old clothes, all torn and dirty, and something underneath. It was like someone had tried to bury something, but hadn't done it right. The dirt around it was all messed up, dug up in a way that didn't make sense. The body, or whatever it was half buried, like it had been tossed aside. I shined the light on it, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't just the dirt that was wrong. The body, or what was left of it, was arranged strangely. The arms were twisted, the hands turned in odd directions. I noticed marks on the ground, footprints, but not mine. Someone else had been there. I froze. My blood went cold. I wasn't alone. Without thinking, I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I was back at my vehicle, locked inside, engine running. My chest was tight, my heart pounding, but the worst part was the feeling that something was still out there, watching me. I knew I hadn't imagined it. Whatever it was, it had been waiting for me. As the night dragged on, I couldn't shake the feeling. The place wasn't safe. I packed up my gear in the morning and left without a second thought. But as I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The trees were still, like they had been all night, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I never went back to that place. Not once. The silence out there was different now. It wasn't just a quiet forest anymore. It was something else. I can't explain it, but I know it was real. What I saw, what I felt, it didn't just disappear when I left. It stayed with me, and as I drove farther away, I couldn't help but think that the forest wasn't finished with me. That thing, whatever it was, still knew where I had been, and it would never let me forget. The real terror wasn't in what I saw, but in knowing it was still out there, waiting for the next person foolish enough to come too close.